Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look at the top stories in the coming week from our Daybreak anchors all around the world. Straight ahead on the program, a look at some key inflation data in the U.S. and how it may impact Fed policy moving forward. I'm Tom Busby in New York.
I'm Caroline Hepker in London, where we're delving into the universe of the world's most famous prizes.
I'm Brian Curtis in Hong Kong. We look ahead to new Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's idea of an Asian NATO.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 92.9 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, DAB Digital Radio London, Sirius XM 121, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Good day to you. I'm Tom Busby. We begin today's program with U.S. inflation data out this week. September's Consumer Price Index out this Thursday. On Friday, the Producer Price Index for that same month. With less than a month to go before its next policy meeting, how might this impact the Fed's monetary policy moving forward? Well, for more, we're joined by Edwin Harrison, senior editor and the author of the Everything Risk newsletter. Well, Edward, just last week, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said inflation's still easing, moving toward the central bank's long-held goal of 2%. And despite a slight uptick in inflation for August, what are you expecting to see this week for September?
Yes, Tom, good to talk to you. We are expecting, or at least the market's expecting, CPI on the 10th to come in at 2.3%. But, without food and energy, which are the volatile items that are in there, that number is expected to be at 3.2%, which is in line with the previous read. So 3.2% is pretty high. The next day, we're going to get a look at producer prices, and those are expected to go up slightly to 2.7%, also well above the Fed's 2% target. So those numbers, they may be coming down. They're still relatively high.
Well, one reason oil and gas prices, they have been terrific for the consumer for the last few months, but worsening tensions in the Middle East, crude prices soaring this past week, that could really impact people's wallets and spending. Will that be a big factor, do you think, or not yet in these numbers?
Not yet in these numbers, Tom. You point out a very good thing, because when you look at the CPI without food and energy, it's at 2.3%. You take out food and energy and it's 3.2%, so it's higher. The numbers that you were talking about coming down have actually suppressed the CPI over the last year. But with those numbers going up recently, it's going to make the overall CPI higher than it otherwise would have been. So down the line, we could probably expect that 2.3 number to kick up from here.
That is troubling data, but we have a lot of good news, too. Let's talk about this past Friday's jobs report. We're showing a lot more ads than forecast, the unemployment rate edging lower. This is good news. A GDP in the third quarter, 2.5%. That is solid growth.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it really does change the narrative. Instead of people worrying about a recession, now people are almost thinking, I've heard the term no landing, as in the economy doesn't land, it doesn't slow down, it just keeps on chugging. That's how good the numbers were. Just to break it down for you a little bit, the unemployment rate ticked down to 4.1%. We saw the non-farm payrolls at 254,000, which is well above the 150 that people thought about. It was outside of all estimates. And, hourly earnings were up 4.0% year on year. That's really good.
Also good. Now, the Boeing strike, that is slogging on, but we had a bit of a break in that longshoreman strike, at least until January, after the November's election. That's easing a lot of worried minds right now, I think. No runs on toilet paper, at least for now.
And, Tom, you make a good point, because when there's going to be two numbers that we get. There was the number that we got on Friday, and then there's another one right before the Fed decides in November. And it had been the case that the read that we get in early November was going to be sort of sullied by one-off factors like the longshoreman strike. But now we're going to get a good read. And when you add in how good this number was with the potential that that's also a potentially good number that we can use as a real data point, it says that instead of thinking the Fed would ease 50 basis points, potentially the market could start thinking, wait a minute, the Fed's not going to ease at all at one of these next meetings.
Oh, so there's whispers now, not even a 25 basis point cut?
If the data continue to be as good as they are, one of these next meetings, not necessarily the one in November, but December or January, the market could price in no cut for those meetings.
Wow. But we did hear from Chairman Powell this past week, and it sounds like if the economic data remains consistent, another cut in November, 4 weeks from now, possibly another small cut in December. So there is a lot of hope that that's going to happen, but it's all, as they say, data dependent.
That's very true. And so now with the data looking as good as it is, I think that we can breathe a sigh of relief. And I think that will be very helpful for the equity markets going forward, because ultimately, when people are making 4% more in their paychecks, they're able to spend more. That's going to support corporate earnings. And as a result, we should continue to see stocks rally from here.
Well, September CPI data out this Thursday, PPI on Friday. Our thanks to Edward Harrison, Bloomberg senior editor, the author of the Everything Risk newsletter. Time flies, and to prove it, a new earnings season kicking off this week. Two of the nation's biggest banks, J.P. Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, will report their third quarter earnings this Friday. What will the results tell us about the health of the banking system, the U.S. economy, and the U.S. consumer? For more, we're joined by Allison Williams, Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst, global banks and asset managers. Allison, what are you expecting to see from J.P. Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo later this week?
So generally expecting solid quarter for the banks. Of course, it's all about the outlook, and a few things that we'll be focusing on. First, the outlook for net interest income is certainly top of mind with investors, given the Fed cuts that we saw in September and the implied cuts in the months ahead. In our view, it's really about loan growth, and if we can see that loan growth to help improve the net interest income on the positive side of things, the beginning of the rate cut cycle, I think, removes some of the concerns around higher deposit costs. The banks still have very big deposit bases, core deposits, where they're getting free funding, and so there's less risk to those deposits and that pricing with the Fed beginning to ease. But again, what's happening with loan growth, to some extent, that also relates to the economic outlook. On the capital markets side, we expect that trading will continue to be resilient at all of the banks. And so this is obviously a bigger source of revenue for JP Morgan. But Wells Fargo has certainly been making strides to invest and improve their business. Equities trading is really going to be the highlight. The world's market capitalization reached a record high in Bloomberg data in September. And we think that the prime brokerage business has certainly gotten some help from the stronger equity prices. We expect that equities trading will outperform fixed income trading, but that fixed income trading will be relatively resilient, helped from the credit trading side of things. The fee revenue side is really where investors are focusing on in terms of the outlook for 2025. It's a smaller revenue source, but certainly helps the profitability of the banks. M&A, which is an area that we think we could see a lift next year, coming off of some very low levels. We think that the dialogues have been very active, but also to the extent that the Fed cuts and the Fed actions help to improve CEO confidence, we could get an uplift in deals. On the equity underwriting side, we have seen some better trends, especially in the U.S. market this year, although a slowdown, certainly more than investors would have liked to see in September, just given some of the volatility. But turning to the debt side, very strong activity. That's helpful for the banks, but we want to hear what's on tap for the months ahead in the debt market. We do suspect that there has been a little bit of pull forward of refinancing, just based on some of the experts' comments here in BI as well as some of the banks. And so that, I think, is a key question for the earnings calls.
And have banks put aside more money for credit losses and some of those, commercial real estate losses?
They've been putting aside money for commercial real estate losses, but credit card has really been the area where banks have been reserving, and that really relates to a lot of the growth. Card is really the area that we've continued to see strong growth, especially at the big universal banks that I cover, which, as you know, are over-indexed to that product versus some of the regional banks. And so a lot of it is just the fact that this is a generally higher loss product. And so when you get the growth and you're looking out over the life of the loan, which is the accounting change that we saw back in 2020, that does tend to lead to relatively bigger reserves. But I think what investors are going to be focusing on, as well as ourselves, are, what are the trends in charge-offs and delinquencies? We did see a pickup in the first half, but the seasonal trends generally support things improving. And so we'll be looking for evidence of that at the banks.
Now, you spoke about an uptick in M&A activity. Are you also seeing any IPO activity on the horizon picking up?
We have seen some pickup this year. We did see a very strong July, which was boosted by one particular IPO in the U.S. So that is helpful to fees. But I think that is something that we'd like to see sort of more of a pickup in the months ahead. Certainly with the strength of the equity markets, we would expect to see a little bit more strength than we have. But I think, that disappointment really relates to the fact that a couple of years ago, we saw, some of the valuation rounds for some of the private companies come at, much higher valuation levels. And so while the global equity markets are reaching a new high, that's not necessarily true for all companies. And for a lot of the companies waiting to go public, they are still waiting on a little bit more valuation improvement.
Oh, boy. Okay, so trading revenue, net interest income, the new earnings season kicking off this Friday. A lot to look forward to. Our thanks to Allison Williams, Bloomberg Intelligence, senior analyst, global banks and asset managers. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, we'll delve into the universe of the world's most famous prizes. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look ahead at the top stories for investors in the coming week. I'm Tom Busby in New York. Up later in our program, we'll discuss what's next for Japan after selecting a new leader for its ruling party. But first, in the coming days, the Nobel Prizes will be handed out in chemistry, economics, literature, and more. The Swedish Academy recognizing and rewarding an impressive list of industry leaders in its 123 years. But what is the influence of the awards today? For more, let's go to London and bring in Bloomberg Daybreak Europe anchor Caroline Hepker.
Tom, before Alfred Nobel, a 19th century businessman and chemist, created his eponymous awards, he was best known for inventing dynamite. The explosive soon became popular in construction and mining as well as in the weapons industry. It made Nobel a very rich man. Perhaps it also made him think about his legacy, because towards the end of his life, he decided to use his vast fortune to fund annual prizes to those who, during the preceding year, have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. In the modern world, some argue that the Nobel Prizes project has an aura of being above the political fray, focused solely on the benefit of humanity. But the institution isn't a stranger to controversy. The Peace and Literature Awards in particular are sometimes accused of bias. Critics question whether winners are selected because their work is truly outstanding or because it aligns with the political preferences of the judges. The Norwegian Nobel Committee, responsible for the Peace Prize, insists that it is independent, with the sole mission of carrying out the will of Alfred Nobel. However, it does have links to Norway's political system. The 5 members are appointed by the Norwegian Parliament, so the panel's composition reflects the power balance in the legislature. The body's efforts to remain neutral don't always protect against a backlash either. When the imprisoned Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo won the Peace Prize in 2010, Beijing responded by freezing trade talks with Norway. It took years for Norway-China relations to be restored. External scrutiny can also become intense when high-profile winners are involved, such as in 2009 when President Barack Obama won the Peace Prize less than a year after taking office. But despite the occasional backlash, honorees enjoy wide-ranging influence after taking home a Nobel. Their opinions on the issues of the day often carry weight for many. Joseph Stiglitz, the winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics, often shares his insights on matters of global importance. Here he is discussing the upcoming U.S. presidential election.
I think both candidates will have policies that recognize that we went too far in what's sometimes called hyperglobalization. And the evidence was that during the pandemic, the United States couldn't produce even simple products like face masks and protective gear.
Let alone ventilators.
Let alone ventilators or even tests. And Europe had become totally dependent on Russian gas. In a book, one of the books I wrote was called Making Globalization Work. After I wrote this book called Globalization and Discontent that explained what was wrong, my wife said, you have to give the answers. You can't just be a critic. And so I wrote that book. But in that, one of the things I said was, it is really crazy for Germany to be so dependent on Russian gas. And
indeed it was.
And indeed it was. You know, Bush could look in the eyes of Putin and say, there's somebody I could trust. But I think the rest of the world didn't feel quite so comfortable. So there will be an adjustment from hyperglobalization in both parties. But the difference is one in which I think Harris is committed to a global framework, working with what she views, with our partners, close partners of those, like our NATO allies, but also our partners in the South. And so it's trying to avoid a rupture and doing everything we can as we adjust our economy to embrace the rest of the world. But the other one is, I think the way to understand Trump is his view of the world is a zero sum. And that means if the U.S. does better, other countries would do worse, other countries do better. You saw the charts about how other countries were doing. His view is that's at the expense of the United States. And so any of you who study economics know that we believe it's a positive sum. If the developing countries and emerging markets grow, it's a better global world and helps us. So it's not zero sum, it's positive sum. And that is the fundamental philosophical difference between the two candidates.
That was Joseph Stiglitz speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in New York last month. So as we look ahead to upcoming announcements about the 2024 crop of Nobel Prize recipients, I've been discussing the history of the Nobel Awards, the diplomatic tensions and past winners, along with the current challenges in choosing who to recognise today, with Bloomberg's Nordic managing editor, Kati Poyanpalo.
So we've got 6 prizes being awarded starting next week, and each one of them can be shared by up to 3 persons. With the Peace Prize, it can actually also go to an organization. So it's a selection process that is shrouded in secrecy. Who is considered for the award is not known, and the list of people nominated is sealed for 50 years. There's even some people who get nominated dozens of times before they end up getting the award or not.
So remind us of what sort of work has won in the past then, if the process is so secretive.
Well, we've got the science awards, medicine or physiology is one of them. We've got physics, we've got chemistry. And these ones tend to award a lot of sort of scientific work that is foundational science. It's things that can underpin other discoveries, things that can be used in a number of fields. So as an example, last year, the chemistry prize went to something that was called quantum dots. And these are extremely tiny nanoparticles that can be used on things like TVs and LED lamps, or they can guide surgeons when they remove tumor tissue, for example. Some of the other discoveries that we have had, for example, in medicine, in 2010, you had in vitro fertilization win the award. Discoveries of various viruses, such as the HIV, the human papilloma viruses, they've also been awarded back in the day. And 100 years ago, the discovery of insulin got the award. Now, for physics, you tend to get a lot of awards for science that is indecipherable for a layman. But some years you get things like the development of lithium-ion batteries, or several decades ago, there was an award for how to preserve animal fodder so that it keeps over winter. For the Peace and the Literature Prize, it can really vary what sort of work is awarded. But really, it's supposed to award work that have had the greatest benefit to humankind, as by the will of Alfred Nobel.
In terms of, though, the issues sometimes around the prize, I mean, Norway has faced backlash for perhaps not the scientific names as much, but certainly for the Nobel Peace Prize. Is there a risk that there is going to be some controversy maybe this year too?
Well, definitely is that risk. So 5 of the prizes are handed out in Sweden and the Peace Prize in Norway. And this also according to Alfred Nobel's will that set out these awards. And what we've seen in Norway, for example, in 2010, a prize was awarded to Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, and that really ended up straining China's ties with Norway. And the Norwegian government had nothing to do with awarding this prize. So it's taken years for them to improve that relationship between the two countries. And so what tends to happen is sometimes the Peace Prize goes to a contemporary, a very highly controversial political actor. And in that case, that can drive a controversy. Or other times you see more focus being put on some national conflict, for example, and then local authorities interpret that as interference in their national matters.
Who makes up the judging committee then?
You actually need to talk about a selection process with this, because there's not a competition as such. The prizes themselves are awarded by a number of different institutions in Sweden and then also in Norway. And each of them have a handful of voting members who ultimately get to choose who it becomes the Nobel laureate. How they get the names, though, is they send out requests to qualified people who can nominate them. These include previous laureates, people who've been awarded in the past, university professors in relevant subjects in the Nordic countries, for example. And they could also just reach out to other scientists who they've specifically selected to give their views. And then they draw up long list, short list, and ultimately there is a vote.
Why do some people think then that the judging, the adjudication, the thought around this, especially around the Peace Prize, then is kind of biased or maybe even influenced in terms of the Nobel Prizes? How does that play out?
Controversy is really from the politics surrounding this. So, for example, if you look at the Peace Prize, when it gets awarded to a dissident in a country, the government of that country would likely feel that is against them and call a bias.
Is the Nobel still relevant? Does it influence on the Nobel Prize winners?
I think many would argue that the Nobels are relevant. There is a lot of prestige that comes with the prize. And a lot of these laureates can actually, they can become superstars of the science world. It can tremendously help the universities raise funds for peace laureates. It shines a light on the cause that they are advocating for. But there are some problems as well. And on the science side, really, a big problem is that scientific research is increasingly collaborative in nature. And so you don't have these lone geniuses anymore. And when you can only give the prize to up to 3 people, what do you do in cases where the science actually, the papers are written by hundreds, if not even thousands of people? So it can feel rather, hard to select who's the winner and why shouldn't another person get it. And then additionally, you can see discoveries being made simultaneously by different teams. So they can feel unfair. Then also one more thing is that there are a lot of fields where there is no Nobel. Mathematics, computer science, climate science, there is no Nobel Prize for these because these were not set out in the will of Alfred Nobel as the fields for which there should be a prize.
My warm thanks to Bloomberg's Kati Poyan-Palo speaking to me from Norway as we think about the Nobel Prizes being awarded this year between the 7th and 14th of October. I'm Caroline Hepker here in London, and you can catch us every weekday morning for Bloomberg Daybreak Europe beginning at 6 a.m. in London. That's 1 a.m. on Wall Street. Tom.
Thanks, Caroline. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, Japan's ruling party has a new leader. We'll discuss his defense policy approach next. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look ahead at the top stories for investors in the coming week. I'm Tom Busby in New York. Japan's ruling party has picked Shigeru Ishiba as its new leader in a surprise result. Let's get to Bloomberg Daybreak Asia co-host Brian Curtis to discuss more on Ishiba's defense policy approach.
Tom, Japan's new Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, floated the idea of an Asian NATO security apparatus that could deter aggression in the region. In essence, he believes that collective security works best when it is obligatory. It's a plan that's very much fraught with risk. China, for instance, has blasted the idea of such an alliance. The U.S. itself has repeatedly said that it's not looking for the creation of an Asian NATO. And India's Foreign Minister, Subramanyam Jaishankar, said that India is not sharing in this vision. So the odds might be against the idea in the short term, but nonetheless, Shigeru Ishiba has made it a top issue, and the LDP did elect him to be their leader, and he wants to explore it. As a result, we too would like to examine it more closely and work through some of the pros and cons of the framework. Joining us now on the program is Bill Ferries, Bloomberg senior editor, and Garode Reedy, Bloomberg opinion columnist, to take a closer look. Bill, let me start with you. It's one of these ideas that seems perhaps good on paper, but might be very difficult to implement. If so, why?
Well, I think when you look across Asia, I mean, if you're really taking this idea of a kind of a pan-Asian security alliance seriously in the way that you see kind of a traditional NATO concept in Europe, there's some pretty big divergences in opinion in terms of how to approach China, whether to, join these kind of blocs that might provoke China or might be seen as provoking China versus just trying to ensure your own collective defense. So, I think we saw that most dramatically perhaps over the last several years with the Philippines, which had a leader, Rodrigo Duterte, who really kind of started to turn his back on the traditional U.S.-Philippines military alliance and really tried to work a lot more closely with China, including on things like the South China Sea. And then you have one election, and the Philippines' foreign policy and its approach towards China and the U.S. really went almost 180 degrees in the opposite direction, where the U.S. Military started getting more access to Philippine military facilities, and there was a much stronger, tighter alliance. So I think when you look across Asia, you do see kind of those differences. So whereas when you talk about NATO and Europe having, I think it's 32 members who have all agreed to come to each other's collective defense when attacked. It's a lot harder to imagine that kind of a framework in Asia. Would South Korea really come to Japan's defense if attacked? Will, some nations, are they really interested in coming to Taiwan's defense, particularly if attacked? So that's one reason. You just don't have more of the uniformity or views about the common threat that you did when NATO was formed and the Soviet Union was looming over much of Europe.
So, Garode, we posed the idea at the beginning that this is something that Ishiba wants. Why does he want it when it seems, as Bill suggested, so difficult to implement?
I think that's a very good question, and to be honest, I don't have a particularly good answer for this. Ishiba is, to my knowledge, the only major politician in Japan who is promoting this, and this is one of his policies that he has suggested. He outlined it a long time ago, as well as over a decade, that he first sort of introduced the idea. But like a lot of Ishiba's policies, obviously, most people were not expecting him to win the election and become prime minister. So a lot of people are having to deal with and suddenly, look up what his policies actually are. And I think what a lot of people are finding, including myself, is that he has these ideas, but they aren't really fleshed out. There isn't a lot of substance to them. He talks about things like, in terms of his domestic policy, he talks about, revitalizing the regions. Okay, great idea. How do you go about that? He hasn't said how he's going to do that. In foreign policy, he talks about, Asian NATO. He also talks about, reviewing the security alliance with the U.S. to make Japan a more equal partner.
Yeah.
Again, fine idea. How are you actually going to go about that in practice? And I think, when it comes to Asian NATO, is like, assuming you did want to set this up, obviously the first thing that you need is the involvement and the sign-off of the United States. And without that, it's not really going anywhere.
So it's difficult to get a real clear picture of exactly who he is and what he wants. He seems like a polar opposite to the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was pretty successful. One of the things that Abe really wanted was a strong Japan. It seems that Ishiba does not have that same ambition. Is that right? And how does that kind of figure into wanting some sort of formalized security alliance if you're not necessarily pushing for a very strong Japan itself?
I think the difference between Ishiba and Abe is that, Abe wanted a strong Japan that, projected that had the ability to project its force, sort of in line with what a large country and what a large economy it is. Ishiba seems a little bit more isolationist, would be taking it too far, but I do think he wants stability rather than, necessarily a Japan that can exert its influence further in the region. And I guess this is maybe where he has approached the idea of Asian NATO from, in that he's not incorrect to point out that, the reason that, one of the reasons that Ukraine was invaded and other countries haven't been invaded is because it wasn't a member of NATO and didn't have those security guarantees. So I think he is sort of more like a safety first kind of approach, certainly compared to Abe. And, as I say, it is a fine idea to say collective self-defense would decrease the risk of any one partner being involved. That's not an incorrect take to have. It's just how do you get there? I don't believe he has articulated that within his own head. Has he decided that?
Bill, if he continues to talk about it, how much would this increase tensions with the United States? And I guess also part of that question is, why would the U.S. oppose it?
It's interesting to have a leader in Japan who's espousing these views now, because I will say in some ways it does dovetail with some of the trends that we've seen in terms of, the geopolitics of the region. I mean, you've seen this trend over years of Japan seeming to be a little bit more comfortable promoting its own military kinds of missions its military undertakes. I mean, we just saw a Japanese ship sailing through the Strait of Taiwan for the first time. We have seen this bigger embrace with the U.S. Japan is now talking about improving some of its shipbuilding, ship repair facilities for visiting U.S. Navy ships. So I think actually some of this, or quite a bit of it, might dovetail quite well if you're sitting in Washington thinking about national security issues in Asia. I mean, you want to have more partners in the region doing more on defense. And frankly, it kind of dovetails well with talking about the U.S. election, whoever wins. I mean, I think there's been this Trumpification of foreign policy where there was a lot of questions about whether the U.S. Under Trump would really stand by some of these alliances. So I think what we have in Japan now is talk about, well, listen, we need to be able to do more on our own. We need to be stronger at home. And a lot of these policies like building up the military budget, the defense budget, that plays into that. It also plays well into a more traditional foreign policy stance of, the U.S. wants to work with partners in Asia. So I think it's going to work pretty well with kind of regardless of who's in the White House.
If there was some sort of security apparatus like this, it would reduce the cost of the United States bill in Asia, which might be seen as a good thing by some Republicans, I guess, because Trump has been big on this. But would it diminish the influence of the United States in the region? And is that one reason why the U.S. would be kind of careful about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a hedge, I think, on Japan's part, depending on, we've seen U.S. policies. I talked about how the Philippines changed policy with respect to China early on. I mean, we've seen, the U.S. drastically go in different directions in terms of how it approaches alliances. And, Donald Trump spent a lot of time saying Japan and South Korea just weren't spending enough on their collective defense. They weren't paying enough for U.S. troops. So this is, I think this approach we're seeing in Japan is a little bit of an insurance policy to kind of protect against that kind of a scenario.
Garode, you say that the LDP had to skew radical with this choice, and it did so. And you mentioned that, this is a bit of a surprise. So I guess it's kind of a radical idea to pick Shigeru Ishiba. What else about him kind of tilts to radical?
I think you nailed it kind of earlier in the conversation when you said that he's almost the anti-Abe. So within the party for close to a decade now, he has been on the outskirts. Abe famously defeated him in 2012 to become the leader of the LDP for the second time, and then shortly after that, Abe became prime minister when they had the election. Ishiba initially was kind of like welcomed into Abe's cabinet, but he was always a sort of critical voice within it. And then since around 2015 or 2016, I can't remember exactly which, he has just been on the outside and not involved in power. As a result of this, he has just become sort of a more and more critical voice within the LDP. There are many people within the LDP who consider him to be a traitor, not just for, being critical, but, he left the party once in the 1990s only to come back to it later. I do think that in a different, a more, shall we say, a more normal leadership election, he would not have had a chance to win. It was only because the LDP is in such a bind between the slush fund scandal, unification church issue, and Kishida's own lack of popularity, that they turned to someone like Ishiba, who is, as I say, represents completely different wing of the LDP to those that have dominated power for the last, over a decade. Obviously, Abe came from the right. Kishida was more of a centrist, but without, let's say, a sort of like a strong vision. Ishiba's election very much turns the party to more of its, I guess, the more left-leaning side. Obviously, he's still a conservative politician, and it's still a conservative party, but he represents a very, very different side from what people might be used to.
Garode, thank you so much. Bill, you too. Garode Reedy there, Bloomberg opinion columnist with us, along with Bill Ferry, is Bloomberg's senior editor. I'm Brian Curtis, along with Doug Krisner. You can catch us every weekday here for Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, beginning at 8 a.m. in Hong Kong and 8 p.m. on Wall Street. Tom?
Thank you, Brian, and that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend. Join us again Monday morning at 5 a.m. Wall Street time for the latest on markets overseas and the news you need to start your day. I'm Tom Busby. Stay with us. Top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.